In today's show, leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher and I are going to talk about the crisis, the fact that the great Australian dream of home ownership is fading away, slipping further out of reach for millions of younger Australians. Now, this is an episode of my weekly Demographics Decoded podcast that I run with Simon every week, but because it was so popular on that show, and this show, my Peculiarities podcast, has a very different audience, I'm replaying the show. But if you don't subscribe to Demographics Decoded, I think you should, because we discuss the trends shaping our future, and demography is going to change our housing markets and businesses in general too. So today we're going to discuss the impact of demographic shifts, migration, investment trends on home ownership, as well as the growing trend towards renting. So whether you're a homeowner, a property investor, thinking about your kids moving into the housing markets, I believe my conversation is going to help you understand the complexities of what's ahead. I guess that's the aim of this show, where we try and cut through the complexities and the mixed messages and bring you some clarity about our housing markets. So welcome once again to the Michael Yardney podcast. Let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Kuestenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. But today I'd actually like to, rather than look at the future, look at the past, because I want to talk about home ownership rates in Australia and the great Australian dream of home ownership. I mean, if you think about it, for over a century, owning your own home was just seen as a rite of passage in Australia. It was an expectation but this dream of owning your own home seems to be slipping further and further out of reach for millions of Australians. So Simon, today I'd like to look at the history of home ownership and some of the changes, things that have affected it, whether it's been economic problems, wars, investors, migrants, all the things people are blaming on home ownership rates, and how it's been skewed with different demographics.
Fantastic.
So let's set the scene, Simon. If we go back to the beginning of the previous century, in the 1930s, approximately 41% of properties at the time were rental properties, and only 60% were owned by Australians. I guess this came after the Great Depression, when there wasn't the ability to pay for your home or own your home.
No, yeah, this is of course a terrible time in history. If you go back about 100 years ago, you just lived through the First World War, you lived through a Great Depression, you're looking forward to a Second World War, you don't know it yet. But this is a rough period. And there was Australia was much poorer then, much more low income workers who definitely wouldn't have home ownership on their radar, where they lived hand to mouth, many of them. And so you had, of course, a relatively high share of those dwellings being owned by investors who rented it out to the low-income workforce.
And if you think about it, there wouldn't have been all the rental regulations and the ability for tenants to be able to ask for things that they can today. However, Simon, then there was a golden era of home ownership as Australia's home ownership climbed in the post-World War II era, boosted by the governments. The Menzies government had a number of programs for returned servicemen.
Yeah, and we saw something similar in the US, where this was economies that were struggling. You needed to create some sort of economic boost. And there's nothing better than building. And this always provides an economic boost. So you make sure that you give land away for free, for cheap for people. And that encourages people to build up a bit of wealth. And you wanted to also, in a sense, treat those returned service personnel for their sacrifices. So that is understandable. It drives up economic prosperity, economic activity. This is good for a country. but it also means you need to build more infrastructure. We didn't have enough people in the country to do this. And so we looked at European nations like Greece or Italy that at the very same time had super high unemployment rates and no economic opportunities whatsoever in the short term. So we took in Greek and Italian migrants who helped us to build these initial dwellings. And we also gave them a chance of home ownership, of land ownership in these countries. That work your butt off, you can afford a small bit of land. That worked. And this kind of mindset of home ownership, these migrants then actually instilled into the hearts and souls of their second and third generation migrant cohorts as well. And so we further in this period of history worked on the ideal of Australians that you must own your own home.
Well, my parents came in the middle of 1950s in 1956 with me as a little 3-year-old with the concept of having a country where there was safety, security, financial abundance, and the ability to own a home. But they rented too. In fact, I remember, well, I've been told I can picture it, but I think I've made it up in my mind about renting just rooms, as a lot of people did when they first came to Australia. We didn't or couldn't even afford to rent a house. But that led to the point where in the 1966, Australia's home ownership rate peaked at 73% of occupied homes. And that also occurred, Simon, because of the ability to borrow money as well. Apparently in 1947, only 8% of Australians had a mortgage against their home, not because they were so wealthy, but it was much harder. And with the growing accessibility to finance and multiple banks and then eventually building societies, the number of people who could borrow and then their wives' incomes were taken into account, this made it much easier to get into the housing market, Simon.
Yeah, so we created a system that first gave people more money so that it could make access to money easier for people. And so all of a sudden you could actually, with a bit of strategizing, think about getting a house. That increased the number of homeowners or the share of homeowners in Australia. But if you give more and more people to those into the property sector, then of course it becomes increasingly, it drives up the price. And so the lowest end of the market then still struggles to get into it bit by bit. And so then these low income earners need landlords to provide housing to them in the short term. So that means we reached a peak in home ownership rates rather quickly. Of course, we also made it as a very attractive investment and an even more interesting investment as we've realized, well, this population growth thing that continues to occur. So housing will not run out of land. We also, by the way, since the 1950s, did not create new cities in Australia. The Gold Coast would have been the last new sizable city we added to Australia. So that means we made land scarce, even though we live in a gigantic continent. So that drove land prices up. And so then you price certain kind of people out of the ownership game.
Well, as you said, private investors in general supported the rental accommodation in Australia. The government created in the 60s and 70s a lot of social housing in Melbourne. There are those high-rise towers that are today out of date. So it created social housing, even though not enough. But it didn't create housing for the average Australian. But that's very different to how it's been done overseas, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Especially if we look at Europe, these are different cities that function under different models. So if you look at how housing was provided in the post-war area in Germany, anywhere in Europe, you have bombed out cities, relatively dense cities with medium density dwellings. You are not building this house yourself. Whereas in Australia, a returned serviceman, they buy a bit of land, they could build this house themselves. So with like just one local builder, they could build a house. If you need to move into a 4 or 5 story dwelling in Warsaw, in Berlin, in London, this needs to be built by a big company. It needs to be financed by a big bank. There needs to be heaps of architects involved, whatever. So it's a much bigger thing that cannot be pulled off by the mom and dad type investor or mom and dad type property developer. So you then hand this out to either some sort of big landlord or a state who finances and rents this out for you. So there are different urban dynamics that shaped the ownership rate in Europe in a different way than it did in Australia.
Now, while homeownership remains a strong aspiration for most Australians, after that peak of homeownership in the 1960s, now only about 66% of Australians own their own home, about 7 million households in 2025. Now, I say only 66%, but still by world standards, that's very high. But the census shows that different demographic groups have different levels of homeownership. That's not surprising though, is it, Simon?
No, not at all. Especially since we are changing the way we live our lives. So back in the 50s, a small share of people would have gone to university. Biggest number of people would have started earning right out of high school. Some people started earning as early as 15 when they left after year 10 or something. So that is not the case now. We are sending half of our year 12s into university. That means they only start earning money at scale in their early to mid 20s now. So that of course means you can only then start to save up for a house that has become more expensive. So that means you can only put the down payment down much later. So all those pressures mean that the average 30-year-old today is less likely to own a home than the average 30-year person 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. And I think this trend will continue because ultimately none of the levers that I'm looking at suggest that house prices or land prices would significantly go down. I also don't see that people start skipping university and start earning money at large scales straight after leaving high school. So I think we'll see much more of the same trend continuing forwards, but we must not be fooled by a potential upswing in the national home ownership rate very soon, which will occur, but it does not point to more affordable housing. The simple thing why this will be occurring is that we push the big cohort of millennials and we take them from the renting age of the life cycle into the home owning stage of the life cycle. And so you just take a big number of renting people and shove some of them into the homeowner pile that then technically speaking increases the home ownership rate. So don't be fooled by this. Always look at age related or age corrected home ownership rates.
Along the same lines, I guess part of the stability of the aggregate home ownership rate that you talk about, despite the declines in the younger cohorts, is attributed in part to the aging population. Older generations generally have higher rates of home ownership. In fact, 50% of homes don't even have a mortgage against them.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, of course, the dream in old age. And when we talk about home ownership rate, what does it mean for society as a whole? I'd say before you're retired, it doesn't matter all that much, societally speaking. For your own financial system, maybe it does, but not for society. When you're old, and you stop drawing a wage, you need to make sure that you don't have the biggest expense that's out there. That is the monthly housing cost. You want to keep this as low as possible by owning it and then just making sure you retain the house in decent shape. So that's crucial. So only once a large cohort of non-owners moves into retirement will we see difficulties emerge there. Because by then, ideally, how do you even run a system where you have people that are not rich but and increasingly have no income or a small pension, and they still somehow need to pay for housing, and we don't have social housing in this country at scale. So what's then? That whole system doesn't work. It's not built for this. The system is built for retirees overwhelmingly to own the box they live in. And if that's not the case for too many people, we have a severe systemic problem. But the idea is, of course, to create a retired homeowner. You need to, at some time, allow them to buy a house or an apartment. And so how do we do this at scale? At the moment, we're moving into the wrong direction rather than into the right direction.
Now, if you're watching this podcast or listening to this and you haven't listened to the previous couple of shows, please, once we finish, go back to whichever podcast app you're listening to this on and have a listen to Simon and my discussion about why housing is unaffordable at the moment and how government charges are creating an increased cost of housing. Because part of the challenge for the younger generation, Simon, is the cost of new construction. And we know that's become even worse, more difficult post-COVID with labour shortages and material shortages. But this decreasing level of home ownership is being blamed in certain circles, is being blamed on migrants and on property investors. What would you say to people who say that?
Well, if you say it is because of migrants, the argument is quite simple, because you say, well, migrants also need to be housed. And if we take the migrants out, then we need fewer houses. This means there's less demand for housing, which should make housing cheaper. I was like, yeah, I see your logic there. That kind of takes a simplistic view of the market, however, because we just had a natural experiment during COVID where we actually saw negative net migration. We saw migrants leave the country rather than come into the country. And at the same time, we saw house prices increase. So you want to understand that the house price, the affordability, is not just linked to the number of people, it's linked to how expensive is a house, how much of an investment is it. And of course, property developers and investors, they time when they put product to market. They put it to market when it is financially suitable,
It
attractive.
also has to do, if I'm sorry to interrupt you, Simon, with the accessibility to finance, not just interest rates, but when the government basically allowed you to borrow money by dropping the Reserve Bank interest rate when you were able to get finance very cheaply, boy, did that boost the housing markets too.
Exactly. So that's one element. So it's not, you see that these elements play through the system. Who says that they're not going to play through if there are no migrants in there? So you could then also say, well, if we take migrants out, do we create some sort of other problem? Yes, we do create problems. We have this ongoing skills shortage that is baked into the demographic pie in Australia, where we retire the big boomers. We only take in a small cohort at the other end. When we send for the next decade, we send the millennials on parental leave, at least for a little bit. So that means we run out of workers. Where do we get those workers from? Well, it's migrants. So in the next decade, to argue that we cut down migrants is very, very unrealistic. And it would mean that there are insane changes in the way that we operate as a country and as an economy to make this happen. So I think that's probably not the case that we'll see lower migration. Then you could say, well, it's all just greedy property investors. And I'd say, well, property investors are very pragmatic. But let's first start with developers. Developers, they just build whatever you ask them to, and they charge 20%, 15% on top of that. But property investors, the mom and dad landlords that we have, well, what do they want? Well, they, of course, they want gigantic tax benefits, which we get in Australia for being a property investor. They also want just security. This is just as an asset class. Even if we were to give no benefits to property investors in Australia, we would still see people invest into property because they know this is a safe and scarce resource to invest into Australia. So to go, well, what's the problem with property investors? And one argument could be that you say there are 2.5 million of them. They're a very powerful voting bloc, and they want property costs to be higher rather than lower because this is where they invest their money. The government is trying to counteract this a bit by doubling down on build to rent, because build to rent as an asset class makes sure that a larger share of the property investors are institutions.
Yes.
And so the institutions are, politically speaking, easier to handle than 2.5 million mom and dad landlords, simply because, well, you give them tax credits to begin with, those build-to-rent institutional investors, and then what do you care about what they say? They are invested into this property anyways. It's built, so they're relatively easy to handle, I would say, compared to the gigantic cohort of landlords.
Having said that, they're not going to be able to provide affordable rental accommodation, as has been shown with a number of the projects that are already coming on the market that are really nice projects, and I'm sure they're going to find a place in the Australian rental landscape, but they're not cheap, are they?
No, no. In the current way, if we look at the build-to-rent segment, this is still a profit-driven thing that is being built there. It is not a state-owned developer who could build without a profit incentive.
Yes.
So that's not the case. And a state-owned property developer also could potentially get away without any taxes. Because why would you tax yourself? So that's not that. So build to rent does play its role. I do see appeal for a state to have more institutions invest into housing, also because it's a new pool of money. But yeah, we're not there where we say the state is taking over control of building housing, and I think we're not seeing it in Australia. For a while, I had it on my bingo card when Bill Shorten, I was about to say, when Anthony Albanese was first announced as a prime minister, this man who famously grew up in commission housing by a single mom, raised by a single mom. And I figured, yeah, this might be the guy who puts the idea of a state-owned housing developer to the public based on his personal history. And that's not the case. And so I think, yeah, probably not going to happen in the second term either then.
Well, as home ownership becomes more challenging and the rental market's expanded, Simon, do you think we're heading more to a European model where renting becomes the norm?
Well, the norm, it will become much, much more common. So you know that the share of Australians that are renters, that will increase. I'm absolutely certain about this. That, of course, also has certain kind of policy implications. If a larger share of voters are renters, do we think that rental rights will be strengthened? Absolutely. So it will be a bit more cumbersome maybe for a landlord to manage the property because they have more responsibilities towards the renter. So that might disincentivize a couple of investors, or it might lead to just the real estate ecosystem to provide more relevant services to the renters, and then you pay for it rather than worry about it yourself as a property investor.
One of my big concerns is the intergenerational divide. The average Australian isn't average anymore. There isn't that middle class anymore. We've got the haves and the have-nots in property, and that's going to be passed down over the next generation, with intergenerational wealth going to the children of the baby boomers who are dying off, who already own property. And then there's others who I guess are going to, unfortunately, in the long term, be priced out of the market.
Yeah, and that's not getting any better. I think that the divide between the asset owning families and the non-asset owning families gets bigger and bigger. And we see the bank of mom and dad is always my favorite example here of showing how powerful this is. If you take a mortgage, which is pretty close to what you might actually see over the next 30 years, a 30-year mortgage at 5.3% on average, 5.3%. That means you pay twice the mortgage rate to the bank. So if you have $500,000 mortgage, you pay $1 million to the bank. Very, very cool for the bank. The banks love this. They're the big winners of this whole high house price, big mortgage game. But that means as a bank of mom and dad, if you give $100,000 to your young kids, they get not $100,000 worth of benefit, but you double their money. It's an insane way of doubling a pile of money for a family unit. And so the family unit as a whole, they should make use of the bank of mom and dad. It makes perfect sense. But of course, what do you do if you are just capable of a young person, but you don't have the bank of mom and dad? That means you fall further behind to none of your own doing. So the idea of giving everybody a fair chance, that we are this merit-based society, is like, that is probably not the case as much as we want it to be.
Well, what we're seeing at the moment is a whole lot of first home buyer schemes with the recent re-election of the Albanese government, various grants, including the proposal to be able to buy your property with a 5% deposit, and the government backing you in that regard, not needing lender's mortgage insurance. You can see starting in January next year, when this comes into play, more first home buyers getting into the market, but that's not going to do anything for affordability. It's a short-term sugar hit.
Yes, exactly. These are policies that I think are designed to keep the current system running. That's what it is. Superannuation for housing was the same, what the Liberals proposed. These are not structural reforms to make housing more affordable, meaning cheaper. This is a way of allowing more people some sort of way of jumping on the current system. This is not systemic change. My reading is that in the short term, the political appetite for systemic change is very, very low. And I'm not predicting change there. I'm saying this based on the argument that it will be either the Labour or the Liberal Party that will be in power for the next 5 to 6 elections. After this might change, demographically speaking. But in the meantime, you still have this big block of voters. And if you only look at voters, remember that 3/4 of voters have a house that they live in or have a mortgage on. And so this gigantic voter bloc, they want higher house prices. So for them, they need to cry crocodile's tears about housing affordability, but they don't need to act on it. They actually want the opposite. And as a politician, you very much know this. And you would need to be very, very brave to tackle this. And you can ask always Bill Shorten about when he essentially made a couple of policy suggestions that were meant to drive house prices down. The Liberals just needed to shut up, and then they got elected. And Bill Shorten managed to lose the unlosable election. In a sense, he was too honest for his own good, if you will.
Well, interestingly, what we're talking about is that it's not a simple solution. There are demographic, economic and social forces driving all these changes, but that's what you bring at the demographics group to the companies you consult with and the people you give your presentations to. It's not one simple thing, is it? It's a combination of factors. So tell us a little bit about what you do and how you help your clients.
Yeah, so we try to utilize the power of hindsight, understanding historical data really well, and combining this power of hindsight with the power of forecasting. So we do forecast demographic data, and as long as you only forecast them a decade into the future, it's actually very, very easy in Australia because we have such a reliable population inflow. We know exactly how many people die and are being born each year. It's very easy to then project this 10 years ahead. And so once you get the historical understanding right, you get the forecasting at least somewhat correct, that's usually enough for most businesses or individuals to align their strategy, their company strategy, their personal life plan along those drivers so that they make these demographic trends work for them rather than against them. And that's what we try to do every day at the Demographics Group.
I'll leave a link in the show notes how people can get onto your team and how they could get you to present this sort of information specifically for them. But just, I guess, finishing off today, the great Australian dream of home ownership is facing increasing pressures, and particularly for younger generations. So while historic peaks highlighted how widespread home ownership could be, current trends, I think, are showing that escalating property prices, financial barriers, and interestingly, even the way we want to live society changes are taking priority. So all these are going to interplay. Let's see if the government can help, because I don't like the idea that more and more Australians are being pushed out of the housing market. Path to home ownership, sure, that is complex, but let's see if we can make it a little bit easier for younger generations. Simon, thank you for your time, and I look forward to having a chat with you again next week.
Same here. It's been great fun as always.
If you're a regular listener or viewer to this podcast, you know that I run a property trivia quiz each show so that you can get a real copy of one of my books. At the moment, I'm giving away a great book, Michael Yardney's Guide to Investing, the principles I've used, not just for property, but investing in general. Just go to propertytrivia.com.au and leave us your answer. And each week, 3 correct answers will win a hard copy of one of my books. Don't worry if you're listening to an older show, your entry will still count. And everyone gets a copy of an updated report, and one I've just updated, which I think you'll find useful. Today's question is, which Australian capital city has had the highest population growth in the last decade? Go to propertytrivia.com.au and leave us your answer. As you could hear in my chat with Simon, our property markets are changing, and they're going to be very different from previous years. They're moving to the next phase of the cycle. I'm not sure if you've taken advantage of the property markets so far, but if you want to outperform the averages and take advantage of this new phase of the cycle where the markets are going to be much more fragmented, I suggest you have a chat with my team at Metropole to give you independent, unbiased property and wealth advice. We're much more than just another buyer's agent. We help our clients safely grow into generational wealth through real estate by offering strategic property and wealth advice. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. So whether you're just getting started or wanting to grow your existing portfolio, our team can help you. We offer our clients time-tested frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for close to 3 decades, and we've got a strong track record. So having Metropole on your side could mean the difference between an average performance and outperforming. But the important thing is that it's going to give you the financial freedom, your family, the financial freedom and choices they deserve. So book your complimentary, obligation-free wealth discovery chat. Go to metropole.com.au. I'll leave a link in the show notes, and you're going to be able to discover how we can help you. We're going to discuss your individual needs, let our wealth strategists formulate a plan, or review your existing portfolio. We look forward to being part of your wealth creation journey. metropole.com.au.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
My mindset message for you today is to stop procrastinating and start building your dream home. Look, here's a confronting truth to start with. Procrastination isn't just about putting things off. It's about delaying the construction of your dream life. Not the physical house you live in, but the life you're trying to build. Financial security, strong relationships, vibrant health. Every choice you make today lays a brick in that house. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham once said, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Centuries later, psychologist B.F. Skinner turned that into a practical rule now called Skinner's law. It's simple. To get moving on something important, you either got to make the pain of not doing it greater than the pain of doing it, or make the pleasure of doing it greater than the pleasure of avoiding it. I remember years ago when I was writing one of my books, I told myself it was a top priority, but weeks slipped by with little progress. Why? The deadline felt far off, and answering emails, I guess, felt easier than facing a blank page. So I ended up making a rule: no breakfast till I wrote 500 words. Suddenly the pain of an empty stomach outweighed the resistance to writing. And now, some days were tough, but brick by brick, the manuscript grew, and a couple of years later, that book now has sold over hundreds of thousands of copies. Here's the thing: procrastination has a hidden cost. Just like property, the earlier you start, the more time does the heavy lifting for you. Delay and you miss out the compounding effect, whether it's wealth, health, or relationships. So how can you use Skinner's law? Make your intentions public. Create social pressure. Tell somebody about it because you're more likely to follow through. Tie rewards to the progress. Give yourself small pleasures after you've done some hard work. In other words, I'm giving you ideas of how to make things happen. Work with a partner because you're less likely to bail out if you've got somebody else working together with you on whatever the project is. And set small penalties. I don't know, no coffee, no Netflix until you've done the job. And remember, someday isn't a date in the calendar. Your dream home, the life you want, is built one small brick at a time. Start today, show up for the little things, because how you do the small things is how you do everything. Thank you for spending the last little while with me. I hope you got some benefit from this show. But before you move on to the next podcast you're going to listen to, let me remind you I have another show that I produce once a week with leading demographer Simon Kuestenmacher. We call that Demographics Decoded, where Simon and I unveil the trends that are going to shape your future. In my mind, this is a must-listen to podcast for anyone interested in property investment, but also for business people and entrepreneurs. So if you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, just please stop for a second and subscribe on your podcast app where you're listening to this, or on YouTube. And of course, if you don't subscribe to this show, the Michael Yardney Podcast, why not click the link that says follow or subscribe wherever you're listening right now. So twice a week, you're going to get benefit from my guests and me. And I'd like to ask you a little favour, please. If you did enjoy today's show and you know somebody who would also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney Podcast and Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there are 3 little buttons at the top of the player. Well, just tell them about it. Just have a chat with them. Now, I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing me a favour in my quest to help as many people as possible to become financially literate. And by the way, I've got a special bonus for you. As my way of saying thank you for subscribing, just go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where I've got a bunch of ebooks and reports. It's just my way of saying thank you for taking the time to listen. And remember, the information that we give you in this podcast is general information, not specific information about your personal circumstances, because we don't know about them. But if you do want specific information, you can always have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. If you really want to learn more, you can always listen to the previous podcast, the many episodes we've already published. Just go back to the old episodes, which each have lessons about property investment, success, and money. Once again, thanks for listening to today's show.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favorite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?